This is a very interesting story. I know that a lot of you are very interested in, and it just highlights the changing nature of our demographics, of land use, and of the housing market. So let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. This is about how the pandemic population boom in rural areas has sparked resentment from a lot of local residents. And one of the things that we have there on the screen, which is really useful, is this map. If we can keep it up there, you can see how populations by county, which have gained over 2,000, or at the very least have gained a population, disproportionately are in the heartland and in counties which previously had never seen that type of growth. Counties that lost over 2,000 people, you'll see, are overrepresented, like the Miami-Dade area, population centers in Texas, population centers in California, and population centers in the industrial Midwest. All of this was driven by work from home, people retiring early, people deciding that they want more land, the suburban life. We've talked about that before. But part of the problem is that the booming of rural America, which would be a good story if it was the rural Americans themselves who were booming, is creating both a land use crisis and an infrastructure crisis and a housing crisis in many of these areas. So for example, Montana has seen a massive amount of net in-migration from California, people, second homers and others. Population increases in some cases, Krystal, have sent skyrocketing prices of 40% in rural areas. Schools are overloaded. Farmland prices are dramatically higher. Land use is becoming a huge problem. Many of the people who live in said areas are finding it completely unable to sustain the way of life that they already had, or to be able to purchase the house. Some of the counties in particular that they show which have boomed the most: Jackson County, Georgia; Flathead County, Montana; Hawaii County, Hawaii; Gallatin County, Montana; Moore County, North Carolina; Harnett County, North Carolina; Iron County, Utah; Bonner County, Idaho; Twins Falls County, Idaho; and Bullock County, Georgia. So basically it's like Georgia, Montana, Hawaii, North Carolina, Idaho. These were states, with pretty smaller populations. They're definitely were not ready for the infrastructure boom that they would need to cope with this. And residents themselves are left with lesser services and more expensive quality of life. It just, again, just goes back to the housing supply problem that we have right now. And I don't know. I mean, it's hard to villainize people who just wanted to move somewhere else.
Yeah.
This is America.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But there is something wrong with, if you live somewhere like Flathead, I've been there. It's a beautiful part of the country. It's one of my favorite parts. It's really tough, for me to imagine. You live there, grow up your whole life, it's the outdoors and all that, and everything starts to get more crowded, and you're getting crowded out of places that you've been going to for a long time. That's really difficult to swallow.
It's like a rural version of the problem of gentrification in cities, where people have been longtime residents. Suddenly their neighborhood becomes like the cool hip place for young professionals, and next thing you know, there's luxury high rises going up, and they are priced out of the neighborhood where they grew up back when it wasn't so cool and hipster. I think this is, in a sense, sort of like the rural version of this. And what makes it interesting and even more complex is the fact that it's not like there was an even dispersal of people from cities into places across the country. Is very concentrated in certain areas. So the two places in particular that saw a lot of growth, the two types of places that saw a lot of growth, were suburbs, which we were talking about how rent has become just like insanely expensive to get an apartment in a suburb, and that people who moved to the suburbs during the pandemic because they wanted more space and they no longer had to worry so much about a commute, they aren't moving back. So this is kind of like new reality, and there's a rush to try to figure out, housing, and do we do rent controls? So how do we surge a lot more apartment housing and affordable housing for people in the suburbs? And I mean, in some ways, those locations, because at least there was some level of density before, may be better positioned to be able to cope with the influx of residents. But then the other category of places that really surged in terms of population growth were these sort of like vacation hotspot destinations.
Like retiree places.
Yeah, where like Montana is a great example of that, where it's really beautiful, and if you're a person who's super outdoorsy, this could be a dream come true to be able to live in the town of your dreams in Montana. But these are small rural communities that weren't prepared for this influx. And we shouldn't understate too, there's like a culture clash as well.
Oh, huge.
You've got a very red conservative state in Montana. And some of the folks who've moved there are from California and have very different, values and worldviews and outlooks. And so there's also, even beyond the concerns about being priced out of their own hometowns, people coming in and, you know, still maintaining their LA or San Francisco jobs and the commensurate salaries and what they're able to afford. But there's also a sense of like, is this town even going to be what this town was to me? It's like a sense of an attack on a way of life.
It's tough too with the farmland I was referencing. Farmland is it's at the highest level that it's ever been. Farmland prices are up over 7.4%. We also have seen that a lot of this land, at least if zoning allows for it, even though it's been zoned or was used for agricultural purposes, in areas where they're able to, they're just buying it, they're building developments. And once again, I'm like, okay, well, we have housing prices, we have problems with land and all that, but we all got to eat. And, you know, whenever that happens, you're destroying an entire way of life that's existed there for generations. There's a lot to say here, you know, about what that is. I don't know what the answer is. It's really hard. It's one of those where I really feel for the people who, if you lived in an area your whole life and you're now not able to afford the place that you were, and, you know, in some cases, like Flathead, we're talking, I only know because this is the one place I've been to when I went to Glacier National Park. It is one of the most pristine, incredible places that I've ever been in my whole life. I totally get it, why anybody would have the time and the money or the resources or whatever would want to relocate there, at the very least, for the summer. But there's a thriving population of people who've been there for a long time, long before, you know, any of these lake houses and all those things started to pop up. What do? You know, and especially if you were on working poor, or you work at one of these ski resorts, one of the things they point to is that the North Carolina counties I mentioned, they just have a bunch of golf courses. Well, what if you work at the golf course? Like, how are you supposed to get to work? So if you can't even rent or anywhere in the area, I was just in Martha's Vineyard. They were telling me about the same thing. They're like, yeah, the biggest problem here is all these rich people moved here during the pandemic, but now, and then they want all these services, and then they're shocked whenever nobody can afford the rent, or that the prices are super high because the rent is sky high for any of the people who are in the service sector have to live on said island. Like, it's a huge competition for housing. It's a very difficult problem to actually solve.
I mean, the economic piece is not easy to solve, but it is solvable in terms of surging affordable housing and, you know, innovative programs there. I'm optimistic that in terms of the culture clash, that these things kind of work themselves out over time as people get to know each other. And, you know, the way that you feel about someone theoretically when you're just encountering them in like an online exchange or like, you know, through the prism of whatever news outlet that you happen to be consuming is very different from when this person is your neighbor and you're meeting them and you get to know their kids and their reasons for being there and what their lives are all about. And by the way, you know, I live in a rural area where I grew up. So even though I'm not conservative, I am also very personally attached to like the rural character of my town. So I have sympathy for the view of like, you're changing this place that I like it the way it is. You know, this is how I think of it. This is my perception of it. And I don't want it to change. So I'm very sympathetic to that perspective. But I do think those sort of like cultural tension probably somewhat works itself out over time. And then you've got to, I mean, housing is the key. It's the core of so many of these issues that we talk about. And it's just the most basic building block of people being able to live and feel stable and be able to have families and be able to raise kids and, you know, be able to really like achieve the things that they want for themselves and their families. So that's so much at the core of all of this.
Absolutely.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.